We'll be telling you a little bit about my own work in this field, especially relating to childbirth or pregnancy and birth, sex and abuse, and about both women and children based on my 2 books in this field. I wanted to place it back into Nazi ideology to show that this is not just a subject that other people find interesting or don't like listening to talking about, but it was really part of the Nazi ideology of how to create a master race. And the one thing that was part of their program very deliberately was to manipulate sexuality. And it started with the Nuremberg laws to prevent sexual contact with Jewish women through the various laws. I'm just trying to set my timer here also. Jews were depicted as rapists, sexual abusers. Childbirth was, and sex was not allowed for pleasure or for freedoms. Magnus Hirschfeld's institute was collapsed. It was only really for childbearing. Contraceptives were banned for Aryans, enforced for Jewish women. Homosexuals were punished or forced to have sex with women. Lesbian women were allowed to go by because they could actually still bear children. And even divorce was allowed in families where the woman was unwilling to have more children. On the other hand, they also manipulated the consequences of sexuality to promote birth amongst Aryan women with motherhood medals and other incentives. The Lebensborn program was designed to get more children, kidnapping of Aryan children, abortion being banned for Aryans and forced for Jews, preventing births of those who were life unworthy of life, including the eugenics and euthanasia program. And in the camps, of course, pregnant women, babies, and children were all murdered, and experimentation on mass sterilization was one of the objectives in the medical experiments. And one of these examples, and I'm just going to touch on many subjects that fit into this topic, is some of the experiments like Mengeler's attempts with Ruth Elias to see how long can a baby live without being fed. And she was ordered to bind her breasts until her baby died or had to be killed, was killed by her some days later. Sexual abuse and rape of Jewish women occurred throughout many places throughout the Holocaust. Some women testified, some told others about it, some survived but never talked about it, and most of the women who experienced this kind of sexual abuse and rape were killed. It occurred everywhere, in hiding, prisons, public, private. It was instituted by the Guards, the Wehrmacht, the SS, non-German civilians, fellow prisoners, in brothels, in homes, by Jewish men occasionally, all ages and countries, and at the time of liberation, and in the DP camps afterwards. It was not a unique experience. Sexual abuse of men also occurred, mostly the dolly boys, the peoples. Homosexuals were tortured and forced to use prostitutes. Lesbian love also occurred. It was not specifically targeted by the Nazis, but it was still punished because, of course, lesbian women could still be forced to bear children. There was a state network of brothels run by the Germans, or the Nazis, for their soldiers to try to keep them clean, avoid their infection. But also there was prostitution in the camps. Prisoners volunteered. They were volunteered, put it that way. They didn't necessarily volunteer to work as sex workers. Women had to have 15 minutes for each man. They would service up to from 8 to 40 people or men in an evening or an afternoon session. There were bells to signal the beginning and end. There were peepholes for people to watch. And even some Jewish women were used as prostitutes in these camps. Also related to sexual abuse in the entire camp system, the Einsatzgruppen were renowned for their sexual abuse and brutality. And there were particular individuals in prisons, in camps, in Auschwitz, in Buchenwald, in Bergen-Belsen, and some of these were brought to trial afterwards, some were not. The other issue which has Nama raised is sexualized humiliation, which occurred in all of the camps, or most of the camps, in various ways. Nudity, shaving, forced vaginal examinations. Latrines were dirty, public, exposed, filthy. Filth was an issue. Clothing, the kind of clothing or lack of underwear. the sexual taunting that went on, and also the need and opportunity, and sometimes the function of using sex in order to survive, to bribe for a piece of bread or a shoelace or something, just to survive. And after the war, women survivors were treated with suspicion. They were looked at to say, well, did you survive because you had sex with a guard or with someone who helped you to survive? And women kept silent. This was a time when sex was a taboo subject, even in families. People didn't talk about it. Nama mentioned the difficulty of talking even about menstruation today, but in those days, 70, 80 years ago, it was something you never said. And women kept silent from their partners, especially about sexual encounters, and many report that they never enjoyed sex. The other side of this was that children were also abused as women. And in this book, I came across at least 160 children with the average age of 11 who reported sexual abuse. But it was very much a taboo subject. When I came to try to get to the archives, I was immediately said, this subject is taboo. You can't look at it. You can't research in our archives. It was not necessary to talk about these things. It was degrading to the memory of the Holocaust. It was impossible. The Rassenschande laws forbade it. It would never have happened. It was an attempt to prevent re-traumatizing the victim or her family. It was horrific to think that such things even occurred. It was disbelief of children's stories about abuse, and it could be misused. It was believed it could be misused and for revisionism in the Holocaust. Child survivors, about 33% of Europe's Jews survived, but only about 5 to 10% of Jewish children survived. 1 to 1.5 million were killed. And our sources of information about them are scarce. Records of hidden children were deliberately not kept so that they would be safe. Children were unimportant to be recorded by the Nazis. The children themselves were too young to often record their stories. And although we have about 55 children's diaries, or maybe more, it's not a lot. How did they survive in general? Children were hidden. Mostly those that survived were hidden. Some were in the camps. Very few survived in the forests, in the ghettos, and in the partisan groups. Where child sex abuse occurred, again, everywhere. In their own homes during the pre-war years, in ghettos, in labor camps, extermination camps, as part of medical experiments, when they were in hiding, as part of the Einsatzgruppen or the Wehrmacht, among the Kindertransport children. Some children were sent to safety even beyond Europe's borders, and they also might experience and did experience child sex abuse, and in the DP camps. And some children were sexually abused while they were passing for Aryan. Perpetrators, again, everyone, German soldiers, Nazis, the fathers in their hiding families, the siblings in their hiding families, friends, farmers, Allied soldiers in the DP camps, the Russian liberators, and foster parents, even after the war. And occasionally we have reports of some Jews who were also perpetrators. There are a number of remarkable stories that we could use in teaching modules. The story of Molly Applebaum, who was buried for 2 years basically in a small hole in the ground with her older cousin, and where they both used sex to survive. Another girl, Susie Berghofer, who was one of the Kindertransport children and was sent to England, where she was looked after. She and her twin sister were looked after by a Baptist minister who actually abused her for many, many years. And in the camps, a very interesting story about Abraham Sichert, who was saved by using sexual poetry. He was a poet, an unusual characteristic that allowed him to survive, because he was encouraged to write sexual poetry to entertain the Nazis at their weekly feasts. Children's experiences were denied. They were told it was best to forget and to move on, which was the current psychological thinking of the time. They were told, you were just a child. What could you know about such things? Their horror, their terror, their feelings of vulnerability, betrayal, distrust. They had painful childhood memories and the feeling that life was not worth living. And their children reported experiencing what they called Holocaust denial. Many were both child survivors and the children of survivors, a double burden to carry. The consequences of child sex abuse: fear of sex, inability to ever enjoy sex, marital difficulties and bad problems with relationships, reluctance to become pregnant, lifetime of psychological disorders and physical disorders more than others. And they had conflicting feelings regarding their genital abuses, as Stockholm syndrome very much could occur. Child sex abuse and the Holocaust. There were two, and child sex abuse, by the way, is a global occurrence. But the Holocaust created conditions that facilitated it. It was not endorsed as part of Nazi ideology, but it really created situations where children were separated from their families and were then vulnerable. Often it was a double assault, both sexual abuse and betrayal by their rescuers. They were often abused by their rescuers. And the Holocaust and child sex abuse are two of the most traumatizing experiences that children can endure. Father Patrick Desbois writes, an ideology can deceive minds to the point of annihilating all ethical reflexes and all recognition of the human in the other. I'm convinced that there's only one race, a human race, that shoots 2-year-old children. And I add, and abuses them physically, emotionally, and sexually first. I give these talks and do this research with respect to the women and children who experienced sexual abuse during and after the Holocaust. But I believe we owe it to them to study and to understand their experiences. A, to honor them. B, to understand their experiences as far as we possibly can. And C, to understand how the Nazis manipulated women's sexual and reproductive lives to achieve their goals. This was very much part of the Nazi ideology. Okay, that is as much as I wanted to say. It's an enormous field, and obviously one that we need to look at, but it's one we have to be careful about.